to save me from talking, because I'm tired, I've come from London this morning, spent the day in Brighton, which is lovely. Not as sunny as it is in the summer, obviously, but it's lovely to be here. So most of the time I'm going to spend kind of talking just less time talking and more time showing some videos. We're going to start off with this one. It's a classic. But if you watch this video in full some other time, I would ask you to kind of think about how these future solutions might fit into your life, fit into your world, fit into your house. And I did an exercise a while ago, just went around my house and just took a whole bunch of photos of the various things in my house that are unlikely to change over time, in the time that these interfaces might be. And this might be a bit boring, but, this is a drawer with a handle, light switch, really fun. I'm sure you've seen one of these before. Some technology, we have buttons on things and things for the kids, buttons and switches. A toilet, I'm not really sure which one is for number twos or number ones, but, two buttons there. Kind of a handle and taps, you've got doorknobs with switches. I'm well into my synths, as you will see later, so some knobs. Different types of knobs that are acting as switches on a washing machine, so different options there. Or a volume knob, various buttons on your washing machine. This is all very dull, isn't it? But there's a point to all this. The button on your smoke alarm to turn it off if it goes off when you're kind of overcooking things. Various buttons on these remote controls. I have to use all of these and probably got added some more since I took this photo. More knobs, a kind of a stair gate, nests are cool, a big knob, a big kind of thing that you can turn, really quite nice and tactile. Various products which have handles, in the bath I have these. So it's quite funny, this is the stuff that this is in my house, and this would be similar to what's probably in your house. A whole bunch of knobs, buttons, switches, levers, and handles. And we're going to come back to this throughout the conversation because I don't see this changing. There's still going to be these things in the world. And when we think about those Corning videos of things being displayed, yes, that may happen, but they've got to sit alongside these kind of physical, tangible things that will be in our life. And I actually believe that we should be designing products and services that definitely enhance our lives, obviously, but they have to fit our worlds. They have to fit our likely worlds. And our worlds aren't pristine and white and super minimal. They are messy, kind of lots of stuff from all sorts of ages. And I'd ask another question, which is, what are the things that you love in your life? And obviously there's the people, the activities you do, whether it's painting or designing or making music, but is it really the apps and services that you use? For me, I like objects, particularly music, technology, instrument-type objects. And then there's this, one of my favourite things in the world, and my son, which is a tenorion, which is like a kind of musical instrument that's based around particular modes and scales. So it's actually really easy to make beautiful sounding music. And this is him after about 30 seconds. And there's iPad versions of these things, but I remember when I made this film, I kind of put the iPad version in front of him after giving him this one, and he's just like, no, I'm not having that. I want to play with this tactile thing. So I love all of these things from a kind of product perspective. They are things that help me make music when I'm not necessarily as musically talented as someone trained in the piano or guitar, and they give me a lot of control and flexibility in what I do. But how does this relate to kind of my work? Why do I care about user interfaces? Well, I actually studied industrial design, so that was making physical products where we would work around dials on things or the way something might have physical form and have the physical ergonomics to fit into people's lives. But I spent most of my career doing digital user experience. And what's interesting is maybe for the past 2 or 3 years, I've been bringing these two things together, my past academic education and my understanding of digital user experiences, trying to bring them into the world, as Phil was mentioning earlier, around how much we learn about digital user experience and bring it into the world of connected devices, etc. In my free time, I help run monthly events in London for the Interaction Design Association, and we bring together various designers and people from different backgrounds to come and talk about how interaction design most focused on user interfaces, kind of fits in the world of healthcare, finance, physical devices, architecture, environments, etc. In the day, I am currently working on a quite interesting new transportation service. It's in the field of service design, if anyone's familiar with that. And basically, I have to work across things from mobile apps to wider digital services, websites, etc. And I have to think about the environment, other transportation systems, people, vehicles, maintenance, call centers, and everything. They're all different types of interactions, people to people, people to machine, machine to machine. And the various things that are connected by the internet and by various bits of data. Last year, I was doing something which touched on autonomous cars, actually. I was working with a company to help conceive a new UI for a dashboard of a vehicle, and was looking at various design trends and strategy for what they should be doing there, creating various visual inspiration and thinking from an human-computer interaction design to try and make an interface that hopefully wouldn't kill people as well. And especially when you work in the field of autonomous cars, there's different levels of autonomy and different levels of control and delegation that you might have to navigate between to kind of help keep these things safe. But what was really interesting about that was that we were targeting a long-term future. So, we were doing the work end of last year, and some of the work we were doing was going to land maybe 2025 earliest. The earliest release of some of the thinking that we were doing was going to come in the next 2 years. And the interesting thing is that in digital world, you're usually designing for the next month, 2 months, 3 months, maybe a year, 2 years for some things. And sometimes that the difference is that digital stuff doesn't necessarily last. It changes. If you put portfolio links in your CV, they're likely to be out of date by the time you go for your next job. But physical things, they last. And specifically in the area of automotive design, the car is on the road with the interface that you've designed for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years after it's been launched to the market. So you're designing for a future that's way beyond what you can even conceive now. And unlike Tesla, who seem to be able to update the technology, most of the car companies do not send an update for safety and security issues to any of the cars. So any of these touchscreens you're seeing will stay in that car for as long as that car lives. And I thought that was just a really interesting point around the differences between designing for the physical environment, when you're talking cities or planes, or even space aviation and stuff. You're working on a longer timeline than you often do in digital. So there's a lot of fuzziness in there, and so it was quite difficult to actually try and think about how are we going to navigate what this potential future is. So this is just a very quick glance at a Pinterest board. You're not meant to see all the detail there. Of various things that we were using as points of inspiration for our work. Now, based on my experience and the nature of this event, there's so many different angles that I would love to cover if I had the time. Various, whether it's more about the user interface or general user experience of connected devices, or wider service design issues and design strategy issues. I can't cover them, but this book, little plug for my friends Claire and Martin and Anne and various people who contributed to this book, and I was a technical author for. It's a very good book. It's really big, it's quite dense, but it has everything about all of this stuff, and will say it better than I have to. So I just wanted to focus on one part that I'm very interested in, which is user interfaces. So when I say what is a user interface, what do I actually mean? I mean something that has a user, so a human that uses a product or service, whether they're a customer, employee, citizen, parent, or child. An interface, so a mediator between a system and that user so they can better control it. And there's a classic diagram that Bill Verplank, one of the originators of the interaction design term, kind of draws, where he describes, let's see if this will work. So the idea that a user basically here, the user, they are acting on the world through maybe different forms of handles and buttons, and off the back of that, they're getting a response, and that's helping them understand how to feel and sense things. And that helps them to kind of understand and get a mental model of the world. So to kind of just embellish this, there's essentially a system over to the right that is doing a lot of the process. The user interface is a mediating layer between what what the user wants to do and how it gets feedback. And this is where my psychological theory goes a little bit out the window, with the right terminology, but essentially there's a reaction when you interact with something. And off the back of that reaction, you will have a tension of that particular thing. You hear a sound or you sense something flickering, and then you perceive what it is. So what is that thing? And then you try to understand it, and then you assess it against your needs to then have a thought. And this is a really important thought when you think about other interfaces. You have a thought, but then that turns into an intention, and that intention then turns into an action. So I want to press that button. And this is one of my big problems with gestural interfaces, where the action can happen without any intention whatsoever. And that's a critical problem as we play around with some of these future interfaces. But the interesting thing, aside from all that, is that, there's a lot of different senses you can use to feel, to attend and perceive. Whether it's sight, hearing, touch, smell, or taste. And they all have different kind of qualities, and this is something I'd want to spend more time on, but I'm not an academic, so this is probably wrong. But there's different levels of speed at which you kind of process some of these different senses, and different levels of information you get. So one of the reasons we have touch screens and big displays is that we're very good at processing visual information most of the time. We're not so good at processing maybe audio information, discerning it from different things, or even smell and determining the smell. And maybe some people with very good palates can detect different flavors very well, but not as precisely as seeing text or seeing different colors. And things like sound are really hard to ignore, or a nasty smell or nasty taste. If you've had that taste, you just can't get rid of it. But with visual things, you can actually just kind of ignore it and turn away. So I think we just got to understand there's a whole gamut of senses to consider. But actually, in terms of action and the doing, there's actually very limited things we can do. We do a lot of touching. Most of it, of the interaction to act upon the world is through touching. Yes, we could have things that detect in our facial expressions, but again, could be confused with natural behavior. I'm waving my hands around. Does that mean I want to move the slides? I'm scratching my arse. Does that mean I want to change the channel? But we also, and Ben will cover the talking aspect, we can use our mouths to talk and to kind of translate our intention to commands, but that has its issues. And maybe we could make smells, but not as easily on demand. But essentially, Bill Verplank kind of boils it down to most of the controls and inputs we have in this world are generally either continuous kind of handles, things and levers that are kind of analogous. So they have a continuous control, anything from 0 to 100 or more, or discrete, on-off, digital, on-off things. And he suggests that actually the best interfaces usually combine both handles and buttons. So you have a discrete control and a handle to do it. And he references the touchscreen in a talk a while ago. You can kind of, do the gestures, but you can also tap. That was important. And when he was working on various mice designs, it was important you could move it around, but you could select as well. And that select and drag is very important in terms of interaction. Now, who's Bill Verplank? I mean, he actually was one of the main guys who worked at Xerox on the interface that ultimately has dictated a lot of the interfaces we use today, the Xerox Star interface, which was the first time we really kind of had a more mainstream graphical user interface that allowed us to kind of perceive these different systems. And there's some components to this which are kind of still important today. Different aspects of visual language, the way that the things are styled and the way they look to kind of associate with the brand, the way that things move are definitely very important these days, the motion graphics, animation, video, etc. The information design, so kind of the appropriate metaphors maybe to be using for things, or the appropriate styling, the typography. The information architecture, how things are conceptually organized, whether they're logically arranged, they're grouped, etc. Do they use the right terms? And the interaction design, the way something maybe flows through the different states. And you can think of this as sort of a layer cake. In some ways, the way that you perceive things, you almost perceive the visual language first, and then you really start to kind of feel the interaction design when you start to use things. All of this is still very relevant today in terms of touchscreen technology. But I would say, I guess the setup for this really is just that there's more to UI than just graphical user interfaces. There's all sorts of physical interfaces. There's different types of telephone interfaces, various voice interfaces embedded, and chat interfaces are the next big thing and stuff. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of those, the future present, the possible futures, and what I think is likely and maybe what we could do about it. So, the future present. We're definitely still trying to get to grips with touchscreens. They gave us, ever since the iPhone, there were obviously touchscreens before the iPhone, but it was the first time you could kind of really start to kind of have a lot of technology, a lot of different functions in the one object. And this was became very a convergent device, which had its problems as a result of that. But we became kind of blind to the weaknesses. We lost our keypads. And we got lots of kind of things happening when we lost our keypads. Like the things we try to start correcting our spelling, and some extra intelligence goes in there to kind of help to supplement our inability to type accurately. And that made us made us a bit more careless, actually, some of the times as well. So it makes it really difficult. We're still addressing this input problem of fingers on glass. They kind of obscure the actual things we're touching as much as anything. And even Apple tried to kind of put extra logic to try and help do more predictive text after, not following Samsung in that type of approach. And eventually, coming back round, we do still need hard keys a lot of the time, especially when doing kind of productivity work. And at times, we do need a pointing device because it's kind of a little bit more precise. And when you're drawing on things or, even tapping on things just to kind of, it's easier to select. We're all familiar with this domination of screens on various things like fridges or even, I was talking about the car stuff earlier, the screens are starting to replace quite tactile controls. And when you're just trying to reach over to adjust the temperature and you have to then attend to a screen that's dynamically changing its location of key functions, that is just dangerous, I'm afraid. So, I think we have to be very, very careful of this stuff. Some of the things are just kind of plain negligent, and I do this a lot. Any parent probably puts an iPad or something in front of their kid to shut them up for a bit. But, this is happening way too early. And kids love tactile things. They love tactile things more than they love the iPad, I can assure you. So what's going on beyond the screen? I mean, you couldn't do a talk like this and not talk about gesture, and I would talk about free-space gesture. We had the Wii, which is less popular now than it once was. We had the leap motion. Mine is still in its box, unfortunately. I never got it out. I don't think that's succeeded very well, people playing around. And one of the reasons is maybe this classic video of a ferryman. But not just that, those things are tiring. I mean, there's the kind of old tropes around Tom Cruise in Minority Report getting really tired or doing all that stuff. The gestural stuff just suits being used for more coarse control rather than very precise control. And as I said before, it's very easy for gestures, especially like free space ones, to say waving my hands, wiping my ass, whatever, to be confused with, natural ones. And people kind of always try and say, well, we should make this gesture natural. And I say, well, no, actually you should make it the opposite of natural, because then you won't get it confused with a natural behavior. And I don't want to have to kind of regulate my behavior just because I just don't want to trigger something off. Yeah. It's important that the action is not confused with the intention, as happened with Nest Protect. So this was a thing where you can kind of wave it off when the alarm goes off, instead of like the buttons you used to get. And one of the problems is that in a fire, you might be waving around and stuff, and that might just turn it off. So that became a problem, and they did a software update, and I think it's fixed. And it's a beautiful thing, and it works really nicely sitting in the background and talks to you and all this kind of stuff. But the best thing I've just seen today has really been bugging me about this notion of contactless payments that just generally aren't. It's meant to be contactless, and yet you have to just touch this thing all the time. It's not contactless. And there's reasons why, the proximity that you have, they could make it contactless, but they're trying to make it a little bit more explicit. But just here, as someone put this on Twitter today, this guy is basically going around with a point-of-sale device on the tube or on a transport and basically touching people's cards or iPhones, basically robbing them of anything under 30 quid. So these things are kind of meant to be speedy, safe, secure, but it's an implicit interaction a lot of the time. And sometimes just that extra step of did you really want to do this? Might be a worthwhile thing. And people say, well, that's creating extra friction. It's not really. It's actually probably quite a good, secure kind of thing. One of the problems that this sort of stuff, one of the reasons this is happening is that we're often attracted to this sort of magical tech, like magpies seeing something shiny. And user experience people who really care about usability, they've got caught in this trap too, as much as anything. I like playing with new tech as much as anyone, but it's just easy to just kind of think, oh, that would be cool if. And then you just got to stop yourself whenever you say something like that and go, but there might be a bigger consequence. So what's also been happening is there's been an emerging hardware revival. Tech companies buying the hardware companies and the skills associated with it. Service companies actually selling their own hardware to kind of better lock people into the services and to do things. So this is Amazon Dash, and they've got the Echo, and they obviously had the Kindle and all those things. People getting very excited about wearables, not enough use cases, but this idea that we can be designing for something different. And I think that just when you start to think about all of these things, I think, this idea of connected products, I just think the one way I've found to just break it down is to think about three core aspects. There's usually a physical aspect to it, a physical part of the product. And then there's this interface part that can be either physical or digital or both. And then there's the digital services behind the scene, the infrastructure, the intelligence, the processes, the algorithms, etc., that kind of make this connected thing kind of animate and have this life to it. And one of the challenges is that there's not always a good level of harmony between these things. So I kind of developed this model where I just think there's three levels of harmony. There's an aesthetic harmony between these things. So the Nest does a good job of making the sound the same on the physical device to on the actual app, and visually it kind of coheres. And then there's an interactive harmony where you've got the right level of distribution of controls for from physical and digital. So like the old iPod, you couldn't do your music management on it. You would do it in iTunes, and that was just an intelligent use of distribution of the inputs and outputs. And the harder thing is around experientials, how it fits into someone's lives, into someone's home, into the situation where there's going to be lots of different ecosystems of connected products and services. There's going to be the Samsung one, there's going to be the Apple one, there's going to be the Tesla one or whatever. And these things have to fit together in our lives, and we just got to think about these different levels at all times. So what do I think might happen? I'm not going to go too much into this. I'm not an expert in AI, because I wonder how far this can go. I don't know if anyone's seen the film Her or Ex Machina, but these films basically talk a lot about, they put a lot of questions out there. They're great sci-fi that really talks to some kind of quite current issues around artificial intelligence and user interfaces. Ask some kind of interesting questions around falling in love with an algorithm, but also aspects of kind of voice-based interfaces that Ben will talk about. And what this seems to kind of come down to is this idea of this natural user interface. And I find this a really odd term as someone who is kind of user experience person. I don't think there really is much of a natural user interface. I mean, even breastfeeding, which people do say is meant to be intuitive, isn't always. The baby has to learn to latch on. There's a lot of things that kind of become easier, but I generally try to avoid using the term intuitive because it's used so incorrectly most of the time. I try to say, what do you actually mean when you say intuitive? Do you mean that it's easy to use if you've used it before? Do you mean that it's easy to use if you've used something else like it before? Or do you think that you can just walk up to a guitar and just suddenly, rock out on it? I mean, it's just such an overused bullshit term at the moment, and I just detest using it. Other ones that kind of fit that mold are no UI. People talking about no UI is the best UI, or even zero UI, where we don't actually have to do anything. Things just happen around us. And I'm just thinking, is that really the case? And what they're trying to talk about is this idea of invisibility. So the invisible interface is not so visible and not so consciously present. But that has its issues, as I say, with the gesture stuff. And to me, it's still just user interface. It's just a different type of one. It's just not GUI. What it usually is less visual clutter, maybe, in theory, less learning, maybe less conscious interaction, which can be really bad, but as a result, a greater chance of false kind of action based on intention. Sorry, photos. This is kind of a cockpit, and there's quite a few screens in here, which worries me, but if we were to just really reduce this down to like one screen, I would be shit scared of the person flying this thing. And one of the tropes that kind of has invaded, it's been all over business consultancy and everything forever, and is invading like design way too much, is this notion of, this KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. And I just find it really, really distracting. People just are misunderstanding this term simplicity, because simplicity is a very, very complex concept, bizarrely. And so I have my own one, which is YMCA, which is just think of different ways around approaching this, and appreciate that simplicity is actually just a misunderstood, maybe an overrated term. It's not actually necessarily a positive quality. What often happens when you make something visually simple is you push complexity down the layers into maybe more complex language, into more complex interaction design, make something less of a kind of, an interface where there's more knowledge in the world and more of the things where someone is guessing what might happen next. And so it kind of changes this part, are you going to go down a path route like a tunnel vision? So I say this, then this is going to happen. It's like a search interface or rather than, a browsing interface. Complexity is not a bad thing necessarily. It's inevitable. And as we design connected services, and that book talks a lot about connected services and the issues around connectivity, dropping and battery life and all those sorts of things, it's inevitable. We have to find ways to deal with that. Our role as designers is to find ways to tame that complexity for that human. And what makes us designers rather than artists is for business advantage, is my view on that. So with that, where should we focus? What's the likely future? And I turn to the cliched slide for all tech conferences. But it's a truism. Like there's much of what will be our future already exists in some ways. We just got to hunt out, find out what works and apply it and spread it around in the right ways. Obviously, touch and gesture will evolve in different ways. And I'm not anti-touchscreen. I'm not anti-gesture. I just think that we should be using them in conjunction with other interface kind of paradigms. One really interesting bit of gesture that I've seen recently is this one. I think it's just it's kind of one of these natural gestures. I mean, you could easily confuse it with something, but what's the danger of getting that phone call? It's not actually that bad if you get it wrong. You're going to get a phone call and you're going to hang up and stuff. It's okay, I think, but it is quite amusing. Obviously, we're going to see different screen form factors. We're seeing more different shaped screens, all sorts of shapes that can fit into things, which means they can better sit alongside other physical things, and curved screens. And actually, curved screens actually kind of are quite interesting from an interaction perspective because some areas become closer to you. You can get an extra level of friction from it. We're also going to see different types of more immersive interfaces. So lots of talk about VR. One thing I just saw today was around this one, which I quite like. But, we're certainly going to see bigger screens and more kind of things projected, more projection surfaces and stuff. And I think that's really important. But I guess some of these things are likely to be quite niche, apart from, your home cinema. Some of the times they're going to be about people escaping and kind of going into their own virtual reality world, or maybe they're going to be focusing on their work, and that can be quite useful in an office environment and stuff. But I think there's way too much focus on the visual aspects of virtual reality and less on the audio qualities there. I think there's a really interesting opportunity to use sound more and better. And I think this applies to any situation, whether you're visually impaired or not. But I do think there's some good stuff. Actually, when I got my Apple Watch, which unfortunately I've lost, I was using it quite well with directions and my audio as well. So I was getting a buzz when I was coming up to a junction, and I was getting the audio that made me understand where I was going, because I didn't understand what the buzzes meant. But what was happening is the touch was kind of getting my attention, and suddenly I was listening, because otherwise it would have just passed me by. So those things kind of worked well. When you kind of mix the senses, mix the modalities, I think that can work incredibly well. But this piece of work, the next piece, is us to a digital agency in London and in various places in Sweden and the US. They've done a thing with one of the blind charities called Wayfinder, and I think this is a really nice idea. I think that the other side of it, I'm a big fan of physical controls. I think we're going to see more physical controls augment screens, and this is one of my favorite UI concepts for a car. It does have big screen in it, big, huge screen. And my favorite bit of music tech kit that I'm going to get the guys from Ableton to come to a future IXDA London event to talk about this, but this thing called the Push, and it just combines lots of different controls. For what is ultimately, doesn't make any sounds by itself, but Ableton Live is a bit of music kind of sequencing, a digital audio workstation. There's other sides of things where there's kind of a lot more, where the gesture stuff is actually being kind of grounded in actually having gestures on the physical objects themselves. And one of my favorites around this is a company in London called Roly, and the Seaboard music instrument, and they've released cheaper versions of their instrument. And it's just this magical piece of technology. I do think we're going to see more distributed interfaces. So I think this came out in an Audi TT. So what they did is they embedded some screen technology within some of the fans and stuff. So they're kind of planting these little screens everywhere. And smartphones are helping to kind of push down the costs of screen technology so they can live in other places. And sometimes screens make a lot of sense. We did a talk, did a session at IXA London around automotive, and someone was telling us the story about the BMW and the iDrive and why it's a kind of physical control where your hand rests. And the reason is that, you know, the Germans have the Autobahn, they're driving really fast. What you don't want to be trying to do is trying to touch kind of like a touch screen while you're going 150 miles an hour. But if you kind of like have your arm rested, you can kind of quickly kind of navigate the controls and stuff. So I think that kind of stuff works well. It's quite ergonomic and it can work very well with screens. Bang & Olufsen, I think, have always done quite interesting user interface technology. This is a very beautiful knob, and there's all sorts. So this is a mono arc, and it lights up and it kind of animates round. It's a very, very beautiful aluminium knob. And this one, my favourite blog ever is this blog called Knobfeel. And this was the winner of Knob Awards of 2015. So yeah, the knob is here to stay. There will also be lots of buttons in our world, and this is mono. It's very similar to kind of the grid-based UI is quite popular in music technology. There's a lot of power in this, and I've used it as kind of concepts for kind of maybe doing Windows management on trading systems as well to kind of manipulate and see which windows are on or off. You can turn, etc. But you know, keyboards are essentially just a whole bunch of buttons. And I do think that they're still going to be very useful. If anyone's seen someone fly around Photoshop or video or other technology, you can kind of see them kind of, you know, it's just lots of buttons that they're using. They're like playing the piano a lot of the time. It's still very, very powerful, much easier than a touchscreen. And things like the mice will definitely stick around. They're much more precise. My mouse was without a battery today, and I was really stuck when I was trying to create these slides. I was having to use all the touchpad, and like for certain activities, it really hindered me. So I'm kind of closing up now, but you know, how can we better focus for the future? I've done a whole bunch of talks over the past couple of years about bringing the fields of industrial design and digital user experience together, and it culminates in basically kind of a bunch of different people coming together and having, you know, some shared motivations and values and trying to get them to work together and calibrate things like their language, the practice, and the timelines they work to, and find ways to create together and make the future real. And that's kind of like moving away from these concept videos like the one I showed you earlier, the Corning stuff, and actually sort of prototyping out loud. Now, whether that's kind of doing Google Glass or kind of doing a birdwatch thing, I think the point is just the experimentation in the wild. But you might want to use various things like Little Bits or Arduinos or whatever, or one of my favorite bits of prototyping technology, another London company startup called Sam Labs. And this stuff is really interesting. You basically have these various devices that are Bluetooth enabled. They're not physically attached like Little Bits have to be like electronics. They're actually wireless Bluetooth, and you have a kind of interface that's like an if this then that visual programming interface that you have on the screen, and you can kind of create new connected stuff. And this was an event we ran to do new smart home stuff. I'd say the other one, and just bring this point back, you've got to be really careful. You've got to shun the shiny. Be careful of being a magpie to new, cool technology and just think carefully about its application in the world. What could go wrong? So the future of user interfaces, well, I talked at the start around the different things around the house, knobs, buttons, switches, levers, and handles. That it's not much different, actually. I think these things are going to still exist. They're going to change and adapt, but we're still going to have knobs, buttons, switches, levers, and handles. I think the difference is that almost anything can be done physically or digitally now, as this quote from new great book, Understanding Industrial Design. It's a choice. It's an explicit choice now. We can kind of understand the trade-offs of each and basically decide what's best. So the future of interface, it's like today, just with some small differences, some more education, more physical controls augmenting, politer interactions, more evolved touch, gesture, etc. And definitely some new screen factors. Thank you.